Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Ask the Expert. I am Fatima Sidat from SADAG and I'll be your host today. Today's Ask the Expert conversation is a critical issue affecting millions of women and children and the mental health impact that gender-based violence has on women and children are immense. Gender-based violence isn't only physical harm, but it leaves a deep emotional wound that can last a lifetime if it is not treated appropriately. Today, we have a very special guest, and we are absolutely honored to have her. It's Marita Rademeyer, a clinical psychologist who has been practicing for over 30 years, specializing in helping children and families deal with trauma and abuse. Marita has authored training materials and academic publications and consults with government departments and NGOs. She has a special interest in working alongside children who come into conflict with law. Welcome, Marita. We are so lucky to have you today.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you for having me and making this very important discussion open for me to take part in.
Thank you. I don't want to miss out on time, so I'm going straight into the questions just so that we can have a conversation and so we're not missing out on much. So, one of the things that we always discuss or we are asked about is what are the different ways in which gender-based violence impacts children? Um, Children often see it happening and it does happen within their households. How are they impacted and on every level?
Children can be impacted by GBV in a number of ways. The first way is that they can be a bystander. In other words, they're witnessing the violence being perpetrated against someone that they love. And this is particularly devastating for children to see, and especially if their parents are both involved in these altercations. The people that you trust to keep you safe and to nurture you are the people who are in conflict with each other. So witnessing GBV can be very traumatizing for children. But we also find that children can acquire negative role models. In other words, they are observing what's happening and the violence around them, and then start to think that this is actually a normal way of conducting a relationship. So what happens in those cases is that they can have a wide-ranging effect on children's relationships, their own relationships with their peers. They might become violent towards their peers, or in their adult relationships when they're themselves. Very wide-ranging in terms of socializing relationships and their emotional world.
Thank you, Marita. I think you put it in such a nice way because it leads up to the next question. And we can see that impact on children and how their behavior adjusts through all whatever they are witnessing or are being in contact with. What behavioral signs might indicate that a child is witnessing or experiencing violence at home for teachers that are watching or family members that are watching? I think those signs are so important so that they can identify them early and support them as well.
Children can react in generally speaking, in one of two ways. The first way would be to turn the trauma inwards. We call that internalizing. So these are the children who might become withdrawn, who would lose interest in things that usually interest them, not wanting to socialize. And these are generally the kids who are more difficult to spot. Some children externalize. In other words, they turn the emotions that they experience towards the outside world. And these are the kids who might get into trouble, who might become violent towards other children. These are the children that you can generally see that something is going wrong in their lives. But the children who internalize are a little bit more difficult to spot. So the signs can be, one or the other.
Thank you for that. I think with children, it's so sensitive because sometimes we see those signs, sometimes we miss it, sometimes we think it's just misconduct or normal children behavior. And it's very difficult to just pinpoint what is going on with them. And for children that are exposed to childhood trauma from GBVs, this particularly, and they often are affected in their relationships and the way they trust people around them. And it goes into their later ages as well. How does this type of trauma impact these relationships? What are some of the things that people are experiencing? I'm assuming you see them when they're a bit older and they're experiencing these relationship problems. What are some of those relationship issues that they do experience?
You know, the parents are the first and the most important role models in any child's life. And children will use what they experience at home almost as a template for future relationships. And sadly, we see cycles of abuse that carry across generations. And very often we would see, in general terms, boys would identify more with the aggressor because generally the aggressor would be a male figure, and girls would identify more with the victim, who would generally be a female. Although, of course, there are cases of intimate partner violence where women are abusing men. Um, of course, not as often as men abusing women, but it certainly is something that we have to be cognizant of. So sadly, women who've grown up in a house where there's interpartner violence might think and start learning that that is the appropriate way to do things. Men are the ones who have the power, and women are the ones who are powerless. And boys very often then adopt the role of the aggressor because that's the one who has the power, and they begin to think that masculinity is about power and coercion, whereas in actual fact, masculinity is about many other things. So sadly, we see those patterns repeating themselves across generations.
Interesting that you mentioned the fact of the power dynamics that go on. Um, I know this question just pops up to mind right now, but I think I want to ask it is how does these new power roles then play into your life thereafter? So for instance, if a child's at school, they are maybe the bully, or at the workplace, they become that bully, or they're the ones that accept being bullied. How how often do you see the link between the two?
Very often, because in a situation where there, especially if there's overt violence, in other words, violence that you can see, it's physical violence, so it's hard to miss. In those cases, we often see that the children are modeling on the behavior of the person who's the most successful. So if you are using your physical power to win an argument, you will be, in inverted commas, the winner of that argument. And children may identify with the person who has the most power because that's the person who, at the end of the day, is in control of the situation. And the opposite is true as well. Some children would identify with the victim in a situation and may feel helpless to assert themselves, or helpless to put their own opinions forward later in life. And even in the during the time that the violence is happening at home.
That is so interesting. I think there's so much links between different behavioral patterns that may become an issue later in life with the exposure to gender-based violence and the impact it has on children and people on general is it's a lot. And I think if people are going through this, they need to reach out for help as soon as they start seeing some of the symptoms or some sort of change in their behavioral patterns or their emotional well-being. Saying that, what are some of the simple but effective ways caregivers can help a child feel safe again after experiencing or being exposed to the violence?
But I think it's so important for us to say to each other that children are exposed to violence in so many areas of their lives. Intimate partner violence, we used to refer to that as domestic violence, is still at unacceptably high levels in our country. But then children are exposed to violence at school, they're exposed to violence in their communities, in the streets where they live. So in many ways, the exposure is almost in every area of a child's life. I think it's really important for caregivers and parents to first of all look after themselves. If you are in a relationship where you are finding that you cannot control your temper, and you're hurting your loved ones around you, seek help. If you are in a situation where you are being hurt, or are being abused, it's important to seek help, because there's no true way of making a child feel safe unless the situation at home is safe. And I think we, as a society, we need to stop vilifying men, and start looking at positive ways of helping our boy children grow into men that we can be proud of, and to design interventions to help men to react differently than they are at home. And also just to mention that our girl children fall victim to GBV at unacceptably high levels, but our boy children do as well. The sexual abuse of boys in South Africa actually exceeds that of girls. That's now all forms of sexual abuse. So we have to protect our girl children, but if we've done that, we've only succeeded in making half of our childhood population safe. We've neglected the boys. Sorry, just my soapbox moment that I slipped in there, because our boy children, in my opinion, have to fend for themselves, and they're privy to much less protection than our girl children, and we mustn't forget about them. But I think we need positive ways of engaging with families to help them to solve their difficulties in non-violent ways.
I think it's so interesting that you bring up the fact that we do need to focus more on our boy children, and also just spending more time acknowledging the fact that they also go through the different types of gender-based violence in households. Um, when we were speaking about how caregivers can support their children, but my next question is what treatments or what type of help is there to support a person experiencing gender-based violence, and how do they start the process?
Fatima, that's a very good question, because we find that in our country there's very unequal access to mental health services. And that's why the work that what your organization is doing is so incredibly important, because it's filling a void. We know that our state-run services are not nearly up to the task of providing psychosocial support for children and families going through difficulty and experiencing GBV, and that for the most part NGOs are offering services to these families, and that these services are few and far between, and very few people, for instance, in rural areas, have any access to services. So I think as a society, we really have to think about putting together programs that make sense for adults and for children, to support them and to help them, because we're not doing nearly enough. People very often phone and they ask, do you have a referral for X, Y, and Z in KZN? And Limpopo. And there's a lot of head scratching that goes into that, because there might be 2 or 3 or 4 NGOs working in that area and they're completely inundated. So, but I do think we have to also reach out to our religious communities for support, and not only look at the formal psychosocial sector, because there's not really enough of that to go around.
I think you bring such a great point in about a holistic overview of support, and how important it is. I mean, to create change or positive change within a community, it takes many different people with different skills to create that change. And I think it is important to, start that process of intervention and have a different mindset as to how we want to integrate everyone so that we work together for better change. Saying that, what are some of the long-term effects on mental health that adults should be aware of when a child has been exposed to gender-based violence for such a long period of time?
There's a wide range of negative outcomes. Of course, there are children who are resilient, or families that can access, some kind of support, who can be absolutely fine. But there's a wide range of negative outcomes, and that can reach all the way from substance abuse. Interestingly, one of the negative outcomes of family violence is obesity, and reproductive health problems in both men and women. So you can have real negative physical outcomes, and you can have negative outcomes psychologically speaking. Of course, anxiety and depression would be two of those. But trauma at an early age, and especially chronic exposure to trauma, can lead not only to psychological but to physical, to negative health outcomes. And I don't think that's very widely known.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think trauma comes in different ways and forms, especially if someone's exposed to that type of violence for a prolonged period of time, especially in the critical development stages as children. Um, I just want to talk about trauma for a bit. What are some of the symptoms a child may experience over time going into their early adulthood when it comes to trauma? So, like, how do we unpack trauma, especially amongst people that experience gender-based violence?
Okay. Sorry, Fatima, if I might just go back, and just mention, I think it's important for people to know that even very young children, even if they cannot necessarily remember the traumatic events or put words to the traumatic events, even young children and babies can be traumatized by GBV in the home, interpersonal partner violence, because that's the sounds, the sensory input, the screams, sometimes being held in the mom's arms while something is happening. Even small children can be traumatized. So some of the generic terms, sort of signs of trauma would be flashbacks, certain triggers that puts the child right back into the trauma response, nightmares, difficulty sleeping, what it may look like concentration difficulties, but it's actually children who are being hypervigilant. In other words, they are keeping an eye on their environment the whole time, scanning the environment for possible threats. So those are some of the most common symptoms that you would see in trauma.
Thank you. I just received a question from one of the audience, and I think it feeds back so well into how you explain trauma. This person's asking, my child witnessed violence at home and now they are very anxious. How can I make them feel safe again?
I think the first important thing would be to make sure that the violence is not ongoing, because as long as there is violence in a child's environment, the child's survival brain is going to be switched on, and it's going to be very difficult for that child to enter a calm state. So first of all, try to make your family as safe as possible. And second of all, try to regulate yourself. If a caregiver herself is feeling anxious and unsure, that's what the child is going to be feeling as well. So we need to have a look at the environment, the circumstances in the home, and how the caregivers are modeling their own behavior first before we even try. Otherwise, we're sticking a band-aid. Helping a traumatized child doing breathing exercises as a way of alleviating the anxiety will only work for as long as you're doing it. And if the child goes back to that situation that is threatening, the anxiety is going to kick right back in.
It's so, I love the way you mentioned that it's almost like sticking a band-aid if you keep your child in the same environment. And we hear of, people in this situation that have difficulty getting out because they're so financially reliant on the person they're living with, or they sort of, keep getting into that place where the person promises not to do it and then they go back to doing the same thing. Um, how how often do you come across people that have difficulty moving on from that environment? And what are some of the steps people can take if they are struggling to get out of this difficult environment into a more safer space?
Sure. Fatima, I think I would go as far as to say that in every case, especially intimate partner violence, it's difficult to let go of a relationship. It's difficult to let go of a marriage. Sometimes people don't have a choice because they're financially dependent on the person who's also the person who's hurting them. So it's incredibly difficult. I think it's part of the whole landscape is how difficult it is to get out. And for some people, it's near impossible to be able to disengage themselves, from those sorts of circumstances. But I think for people to access help, sometimes you might need to go the judicial route. You might need to get support from law enforcement. Sometimes you can get support from women's shelters. There are, at least some of them in our country. Sometimes reaching out to someone in the community who's got influence and who may be able to assist. So I think it's important that people, as far as possible, reach out and try to make things different. But we do realize it's incredibly difficult.
For that. We just got a question leading up to that one. And it's this person says, I think someone close to me is being abused, but she denies it. How can I support her without making her feel like I'm pushing her too hard?
That's such a difficult one because very often the signs are there that someone is being abused, and people are, of course, in a relationship with the abuser. So to some degree, they're loyal to that person. To some degree, they are ashamed of what's happening. They might even feel that they themselves are part of the problem. There might be self-doubt and self-blame. And I think it's important that support be, even if the person denies being abused, that they know that there's an open line between them and the person who cares enough for them to notice what's happening. So that if they feel ready to reach out, that lifeline can still be there.
I think this topic is something that's very relatable to many of our viewers today. Because I have another question asking, I feel ashamed for staying in an abusive relationship for so long. How do I deal with that guilt?
Sure, I think that's a huge question because many people who are abused do feel that in some way they should be able to protect themselves, or they should be able to leave, or they should be able to make things different, and then they find themselves being trapped, and the guilt feelings are a very real outflow of that. I think what is incredibly important is to make contact with someone who can see your true worth. That might be if you have access to therapeutic services, or someone in your community, or a friend or a family member who can see your real worth, and try to connect with the person that you are. Try to connect with the strengths and the things that represent what are good in you, rather than connecting with everything that's wrong and connecting with a pessimistic view of yourself. Having said that, it's much more easily said than done. But we know that women, especially women trapped in these relationships, their self-esteem takes such a knock that they start believing that they themselves are unlikable or unworthy, and that falling in that trap of that way of thinking can keep you in those environments for even longer than it otherwise would.
Thank you for that, Marita. I think it's so essential that people that are going through this tough moment to realize that they are not alone. There is support, and there are organizations that can support them. It's just knowing when to take the first step and reaching out for the help that they need. Marita, I know we focused a lot on children and the impact it has on children. And I hope that you don't mind, but I just want to move on to covering some parts of what women are going through, and the impact it has on women. What are some of the early signs people can look out for in women who are experiencing the abuse but hasn't spoken about it?
That can be very difficult because adults have the ability to mask and to hide more actively what's happening to them. So there may be some obvious signs, such as cuts and bruises, but most of the wounds are probably not going to be visible to the naked eye. I think one of the things to look out for is if someone is extremely secretive about what's happening at home, not speaking openly, not sharing what's happening, in the relationship or in the marriage, and a disproportionate sense of loyalty towards the person that they are with, and also putting themselves down, saying negative things about themselves. Those may be some of the red flags that one can look out for.
Thank you. I think it's so important just to realize that not all gender-based violence situations do show the physical signs. You see through other ways, and a lot of women that are being with those physical signs, they conceal themselves until they heal, so to go out again, so you don't know when they are experiencing it. I think it's so important for maybe someone that's watching us today in our conversation to understand what the therapeutic process looks like when you do reach out for help to a psychologist. Is there any way that you could maybe give us a bit of a idea of what it looks like if someone comes to visit you for help and what the process looks like?
Obviously, the first thing that one would do is to ensure the physical safety of the client and of the client's children. So if there's any imminent threat of harm, one has to make sure that your client and the client's children are as safe as possible. So in some situations, if the violence is extreme, one would have to look at a place of safety for the family to seek refuge. And then the process, obviously, one would try to engage all of the partners and see if the person who's committing the violence is prepared to enter some kind of process of changing their behavior. Especially if there are children in the family, an outcome where the family dynamics can change is, I almost want to say, the first prize. And that was also why I mentioned earlier that fighting GBV is good, but we shouldn't be vilifying men. We should be changing the rules of engagement and changing the way that we teach our boy children how to go into relationships. So in an intervention, one would try to see if the other partner is at all willing to cooperate and willing to be part of a system where the family dynamics can change. And if that is not possible, or if the outcomes are not looking good for that, then to help the person in the relationship to find a way that they can live independently, and where they can be free from the abuse. I also just want to add on to, physical and emotional abuse. Many people suffer sexual abuse in relationships and in marriages. And it's very often not recognized as a problem because there's almost a nice societal idea. If you're married to someone, there has to be a sexual relationship and you can't say no. Or if someone's your boyfriend, you don't have the right to refuse him. But sexual abuse is a very real form of GBV, even in marriages, which is often overlooked and can be very, very traumatizing. We also are starting to recognize financial abuse as a form of GBV. If money is withheld from a partner for whatever reason, the partner is told there's no money for food for the children, that can be seen as a form of financial abuse, provided, of course, the money is there and it is being actively withheld. So there are so many different forms of GBV that we find, and we shouldn't just be sort of looking for people with black eyes. It could be very subtle, and there are many different ways of hurting someone or being abusive towards someone.
I absolutely appreciate that you brought into account the different forms of GBV there are, because often we overlook those and we don't realize that it is a form of abuse, and we don't get the help we need until it becomes even worse, because one form could lead to the next one and to the next one. I think we are about to run out of time, but I also know, and we need to acknowledge that we are going to be entering the 16 days of activism. And it's a very critical time, as there's a huge movement happening today around GBV and creating awareness about all the incidents that have happened over the years. If there was one piece of advice that you could leave people with today, Marita, what would it be?
Sure. I think it would be that there's always hope, and that there are ways out of times that feel very dark and very desperate, and that people should strive to embrace that hope, and try to be, the captain of your own ship.
Thank you for that. I think the one thing I'll take from that is that you are not the one thing, there's many things I take from you, but I think you are the captain of your own ship is so important to acknowledge, because only you can determine what would be your next step in your environment. So it's very important to take that step. Thank you so much, Marita. You have been absolutely amazing, and you've given us such great information that we can carry this through into whatever we may be doing. And if need be, if there was someone that needed help, hopefully we've helped them today. But if there is someone that we know that's going through something difficult, then at least we know some sort of signs and symptoms that we can look out for. But you also shared such amazing points on how we could be supporting other people as well. So thank you so much for taking the time out and joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you also for the wonderful work that your organization is doing for the mental health for South Africans. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think to wrap it up today, we thank everyone that's joined us today. And as always, let's continue doing these important conversations and keeping, a safe space out there for many people that may need the help. If you are going through something difficult, or if you know of a loved one that is experiencing something that makes them feel overwhelmed, remember that we are here 24 hours every single day of the year to support you. So please do reach out to us. Visit our website on www.sadag.org. Alternatively, call us on 0800 456 789. We are there for you. So whenever you need, we just a call away. Thank you so much for joining us and have a good day. Bye.